Hey everyone, in this video I wanted to walk through the options we have to synchronize objects between our Active Directory Domain Services environment, i.e. AD, and our Azure AD environment, because we do have a couple of options now. As always, if this is useful, please like, subscribe, comment and share, and hit the bell icon to find out about new content. If we think about a typical organization today, it has its Active Directory instance. Now, it may have multiple Active Directories, it may have multiple domains in one forest, it may have multiple forests, but for now we'll think about, hey, we just have this Active Directory. Now, when I talk about Active Directory, remember it's basically domain controllers that hold that content. And those domain controllers could be on premises, they could be in IaaS virtual machines, it could be a mixture in a hybrid environment. It really doesn't matter. So we have our Active Directory, and then we think about, well, we have our Azure Active Directory instance. And typically most companies will just have a kind of a single Azure AD. And services like Office 365, Dynamics 365, or Azure subscriptions, many other third-party applications will trust our Azure AD as its identity provider. Because while AD supports things like Kerberos and NTLM, that's not super useful for those more cloud-based SaaS applications. They want to talk SAML, AAD Connect, OAuth 2, etc., which is what Azure AD talks. So I have my accounts I can think about in my Active Directory, and my users are used to using that account. Now, yes, I could actually go and create separate cloud accounts up here, but that would be a lousy experience for the end user. So we don't really want to do that. So what we really want to do is give the users a pleasant, seamless experience. So we want to be able to synchronize the accounts really from AD up to Azure AD. That's really the primary flow we have today. And so there are two options we have for this. Now, the first option is Azure AD Connect. Now, this has gone through a number of iterations from dir sync to Azure AD Sync. Both of those are no longer supported, to what we currently have, which is Azure AD Connect. So I can think about, I have this Azure AD Connect. Now, once again, this can run on premises. It could run in an IaaS virtual machine. It just has to have network communication to the domain controllers for the domains that it is synchronizing to Azure AD. Now, with this Azure AD Connect, I can have a single instance of this Azure AD Connect to a particular Azure AD, and we'll talk more about that. But in terms of the engine, there is one Azure AD Connect instance that is active. So I just have one active instance. And this is built on the Microsoft Identity Manager solution. So I can think about, hey, it has the synchronization service. That's going to look very familiar. It's not all the features of MIM. It's very much focused around, hey, AD to Azure AD. But it has kind of a rules editor. I have those capabilities into it. So because it's built on that MIM, it has the idea of kind of, hey, connector spaces for the directories it's replicating and synchronizing with, i.e. AD and Azure AD, and then it has its metaverse where it kind of brings all those things together. So I can think about this flow is really primarily this way. That's the big direction of the flow. There is a tiny little potential, some data going back, but it's really this way. AD is the source of truth going up to Azure AD. With this, you kind of get this 30-minute, it is configurable, but you get a 30-minute sync cycle, and you do get a 2-minute kind of password hash. It's actually the hash of the hash, doesn't just send the regular. So if we actually look at this super quickly, we'll see it does look very familiar with a lot of the old MIM capabilities. So here I'm running the Synchronization Service Manager. You can see I have various operations and connectors. It's connected to both my Active Directory Domain Services environment. So I can kind of see that right here. and it's connected to my Azure Active Directory as well. And then we have kind of this metaverse search where it brings all the things together. So if I looked at a particular user object like mine, well, I can see this object is really the sum of information from my Active Directory object and my Azure AD object. So it's bringing those things together, and then we have the sum of those various attributes. Now also with this, we have things like the rules editor. I can customize, I've added my own custom rule in here. So what my rule does here essentially is I don't want to synchronize a particular organizational unit, and I'll explain why later on, but I'm basically adding a clause to not replicate that particular one. But we can customize things about what we're doing. We have different join rules we can add. There are transformations we can do. So here I'm saying cloud no flow to true for those objects. So I have a lot of flexibility. There's a lot I can do with the Azure AD Connect. So lots and lots of power. Now when I think about this Azure AD Connect, I can actually replicate from multiple domains, multiple forests. So I could think about, hey, I've got another AD over here with its objects, and providing this Azure AD Connect has a line of sight to it, hey, I can replicate that as well. There would essentially be a separate connector space, but then I could merge the objects in if I wanted to, so you get those choices. Maybe it's based on some mail attribute, or I could synchronize them as separate objects. So I have that choice to be able to do that. If I have a single account that's represented as a separate single user is manifested as separate accounts across domains, it can merge them together in the metaverse. So there's just one object sent to the Azure AD. I can configure that. I have that full control. But when I think about Azure AD Connect, remember I have one active instance and multiple domains and Azure ADs, there are some key kind of rules. If you ever saw Gremlins, they're like these key rules, don't feed it after midnight, etc., etc. So we have rules for Azure AD Connect. So rule kind of one on this whole thing is an Azure AD Connect instance can only sync to a single Azure AD instance. Oh, let's just scratch that out. Sometimes it's hard to talk and write at the same time. To a single Azure AD instance. Likewise, an Azure AD instance only syncs with single AAD Connect instance. So the key point here is this relationship is a one-to-one. An Azure AD Connect, yes, I can talk to multiple domains in a forest as long as I have line of sight, but a single Azure AD Connect can only replicate to one Azure AD. And one Azure AD instance will only talk to a single Azure AD Connect. It is a one-to-one mapping. So a single Azure AD Connect cannot replicate to multiple Azure ADs. A single Azure AD cannot be spoken to from multiple Azure AD Connect. So that's really important, especially when you think about, well, what about if I had forests that were disconnected that didn't have a line of sight to this Azure AD Connect? Well, I couldn't do that today with Azure AD Connect. Now, I said this is a single instance of the Azure AD Connect. What I can do is I can have Azure AD Connects running in staging mode. And I can have multiple of those. Now this has all the same kind of connector spaces, it has its metaverse, etc., etc., but it only reads. So So it's only getting the sync that way. It can't write anything back. And likewise, it's getting that very small pieces of information back that way. It doesn't write any data. So it's staying current and up to date, but it's not changing anything. Now, the reason we have these is, well, if this went down, if it had a problem, I can manually fail over and take this out of staging mode. So now one of the staging becomes active. I might also, when I'm upgrading Azure AD Connect, hey, I'll put this in staging mode, take this out of staging mode, and then I can upgrade in kind of a rolling pattern. So that can be useful. Again, this replication from Azure AD this way is very, very small. It's really that direction is the primary flow. But we do have that ability to have the staging. Now remember, with this Azure AD Connect instance or instances, if we have the staging mode, we have to maintain these. Now sometimes the Azure AD Connect will auto update as there are new versions of Azure AD Connect. It will tell you in the changelog if it will auto update. For example, the V2 currently, none of those auto update. And I did a video about that saying, hey, make sure you go and manually update those. There is kind of a lightweight SQL database it uses if it's built in. But if it's a larger environment, then hey, you're also maybe maintaining a SQL Server environment. Now, a key point, this synchronization, remember, is essentially creating objects up here. And so the user gets this seamless experience. If I turn on things like seamless sign-on, if they're on an AD joined machine, they don't even get authenticated, even if it's the same password. They just get this very transparent experience. But what is the link? What's the relationship between these? Because they are separate objects. So the link is this way. It is the Azure AD object. It has a source anchor attribute. And the source anchor attribute essentially points to the GUID of the user. Now, I'm saying the word GUID. It has an object GUID, but potentially that could change if the users move between domain or forests. So by default, what Azure AD Connect will do is it uses an MSDS consistency GUID, which it copies the GUID into and then makes sure that never changes. But the direction is pointing that way. So the Azure AD object knows, hey, this is my AD object equivalent. The AD object has zero clue about this. It knows nothing about an Azure AD object. And you can see this. So if we jump back over for a second, so if we went back and looked at this kind of John Savile object again, you'll notice there's a bunch of different attributes. And what we can see in here is if we quickly we could look at one of the, so we see the source anchor. So that's the kind of point from the Azure AD object. So if we look at the Azure AD object specifically, we can see it has this source anchor attribute. And then if we actually looked at the AD object, we can see, well, it has the object GUID here. And that is actually copied into this MSDS consistency GUID the first time it syncs. Because then if it changed domain, changed forest, it's immutable. That MSDS consistency GUID would never get changed. So that source anchor points to that value. Now you might be looking at those saying that doesn't look like the same value. If you look again at that kind of source anchor, it's completely different format than that object GUID. And it's just because it's encoded. That's all it is. And you can actually switch that out. So if I actually jump over for a second and paste in that source anchor attribute, and we decode it, notice then it's that 13 F1E48 blah 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 blah. Well, that does now look like that 13 F1 0E48 blah 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 blah. So that's the link. The link is very much from the Azure AD to the AD object. The AD object has zero knowledge about any kind of Azure AD object. So that brings us to kind of rule 3. So rule 3 is an AD object can only be synced by one sync technology, one instance. I.e., I can't have multiple Azure AD Connects replicating the same object, maybe to different places. And even when we introduce Cloud Sync, this rule still applies. So an object can only replicate by one sync instance. So what I couldn't do is have another Azure AD Connect instance and try and replicate the same user. That is not an allowed scenario. That will not work. Now, what you could absolutely do is I could have a subset. Now, you saw the rule I added in my Azure AD Connect to ignore a certain OU. So what that would let me do is imagine I go back to my kind of AD again, making it a bit bigger. Because remember, in Active Directory, we can have the concept of organizational units. So I could absolutely have a scenario where maybe I have two Azure AD instances, maybe kind of a prod and a test, for example, and I could have an Azure AD Connect instance that is configured to only take those OUs to there, and then I could have another Azure AD Connect instance which just takes that, or another subset of OUs. That's not breaking any of my rules. An Azure AD Connect instance can only sync to a single Azure AD. True. True. An Azure AD instance can only sync with a single Azure AD Connect instance. True, true. And an object can only replicate by one sync instance. Well, they're different objects going to the different places. So this is absolutely an allowed topology. So if you have that scenario where I have different objects, I can absolutely do it. So I'm not breaking any of the rules. Now, there's an entire list of different scenarios you can have. And remember, obviously, you can't have the same UPN in different, you can't have the same custom domain in multiple Azure AD instances. So they would have different UPNs in the different Azure AD instances. Microsoft has a great document. So this goes through the topology supported for Azure AD Connect. And here we can see kind of the things I spoke about. You can't have multiple sync servers that are active. You could have staging, remember. I can have multiple forests through a single Azure AD Connect to a single Azure AD. I can't have multiple Azure AD Connects talking to a single Azure AD. We talked about that rule. It talks about, hey, you can match users, I merge them or not match them. And it really just goes through different combinations. And then it does say, hey, my staging server, yes, it can do kind of the read, but it's not writing to anything. Multiple Azure AD tenants, hey, I could have different Azure AD Connect instances, or I could have a subset based on kind of, for example, OUs going to different Azure AD Connects to different Azure AD instances. This is a fantastic document. I've got the link below in the description of this video, so definitely recommend you take a look at that. Now, one thing I want to stress, from a supported topology perspective, these rules still apply, even if I'm using different clouds. So imagine I have commercial cloud, what most of us use, and then maybe Gov cloud or China cloud. These rules still apply, especially this one. An object can only replicate by one sync instance. I could not have in the publicly supported topologies, I'm kind of stressing that a little bit, publicly supported, I could not take the same user and replicate them to an Azure AD tenant in commercial and an Azure AD tenant in Gov. If you look at the documentation, it will tell you, hey, you'd either have to have multiple user accounts in your AD, one to commercial, one to Gov, or I would create cloud accounts, for example, for Gov. This is supported public topologies. What I would say to you, if you are a large company and you do need to use, for example, commercial and Gov or commercial and China, talk to your Microsoft accounting, because there are things that can be done to avoid having kind of those duplicate account scenarios for those larger companies and special kind of agreements. So if you are in that world, talk to Microsoft before you start creating duplicate accounts or creating cloud accounts. Also today, you can't B2B across clouds. So I couldn't create the accounts in commercial and then B2B them to Gov or China. You can't do that today either. So that's Azure AD Connect. And I said there were two technologies. So the other technology is Azure AD Cloud Sync. And I did a whole video about Azure AD Cloud Sync. So I'm only going to talk about this pretty quick. But then we have Azure AD Connect Cloud Sync. And here we have the same idea of, hey, look, there's Azure AD. We have our Azure AD instance. And we still have our on-premises domains that again are personified by domain controllers. But what happens with Azure AD Cloud Sync is instead of having this engine running on premises that's built on kind of MIM, the brain of this service actually now kind of sits up here. What we have now sitting in the Azure AD is this kind of hybrid identity service. And it's actually built on top of Service Bus, which is an Azure feature. And what happens now is there's no engine up here. It's all running in this hybrid identity service. All of the configuration is done via the portal. I'll show that in a second. But what we now have are these very lightweight agents that run on premises. Now I have to have these agents for every single domain, and I can have multiple of them. So for every domain, we're going to have these agents. Now all of these agents establish this kind of outbound connection to the service bus. But it's now these separate agents. They're all over 443, so I'm not having to open up firewall ports inbound. 443 is generally open anyway. But they can be disconnected now. I can have disconnected forests all going into this hybrid identity service. There is like a group managed service accounts that gets leveraged, and my other video goes into detail about that. But these agents are super lightweight. They're Windows Server 2016 above. They are domain joined. It's not recommended to put them on the domain controllers, but you actually can do. They are multi-use agents, so some of that provisioning where I integrate with a HR system and it actually creates objects on-prem, it's that same agent that does this. The boxes I install these agents on should be considered secured in the same manner as my domain controller, so I think kind of tier 0. But they all auto-update. The same rules apply to this though. An object can only replicate by one sync instance. So I can't say, hey, have this user sync to one Azure AD by Azure AD Connect and the same user via Azure AD Cloud Sync somewhere else. That is not supported. You cannot do that. Now, as I mentioned, this is all kind of managed. The engine is running in Azure and it is not MIM based. If we go and look at this super quickly, and if I just go and jump over, if I look at my Azure Active Directory, I can go and look at my Azure AD Connect. So we can see in my environment, I do have Azure AD Connect Sync running. Yep. And I also have Azure AD Cloud Sync running. Now, how is that possible? Remember I said the same object can't replicate. Well, remember in my Azure AD Connect, I blocked that particular organizational unit from Azure AD Connect. Well, that OU that I blocked with Azure AD Connect is the OU that I do sync with Azure AD Cloud Sync. So I'm not breaking my rules. The same object is not replicating by different technology instances. But here you can see I can scope which users. I can manage certain attribute mappings. I can see, hey, I have certain notifications. I can prevent accidental deletions, thresholds. It's super easy to kind of deploy these various configurations. Again, I just deploy this very lightweight agent. It establishes that outbound connection, and I'm kind of good to go. But those same rules apply. A single object, is only replicating by one technology. I cannot have the same object replicating through multiple Azure AD Connects or multiple Azure AD Cloud Syncs or an Azure AD Connect and an Azure AD Cloud Sync. But as long as they are unique, I could do this. So in this kind of picture I drew here with this model, another option would have been, for example, well, hey, I absolutely could have kind of my Cloud Sync agent. So instead of this, or I could have used Cloud Sync for that OU, which is exactly what I did in my environment. So I could go kind of this way. So I can totally mix them up. And there's a document at the end I'll show you that kind of talks through those. So we have choices, yeah? We have Azure AD Connect. Engine runs on premises, a single active instance, but very, very configurable. And then I have Azure AD Connect Cloud Sync. Super lightweight agent, the engine runs in the cloud, multiple running, active, very, very simple. So with that, how do you know which one you actually want to use? And there's actually a fantastic document that talks through the options. So let's quickly look at these. It tells you what is supported for each of the technologies. So, I opened the wrong document. Let's have a quick look. So actually what this document, I meant to open this earlier, this is the supported scenarios for Azure AD Cloud Sync. So this talks about, hey, a single to Azure AD, multiple disconnected forests to Azure AD, a mixture, potentially, of Azure AD Connect and then a disconnected forest or a new forest using Cloud Sync, a hybrid environment, maybe I'm blocking certain OUs, and so it goes through those. But here are the features. So what's unique here is you can see, well, look, Azure AD Connect Cloud Sync, well, it supports uniquely disconnected forests, something I cannot do with Azure AD Connect. It has to have line of sight. It also has those multiple agents and a lightweight installation. But then we can see, well, Connect, it supports LDAP directories, which Azure AD Connect Cloud Sync does not. Azure AD Connect also supports device objects, which Cloud Sync does not. Now, if we keep scrolling down, well, I can have customer-defined AD attributes in Cloud Sync, which I cannot, in Azure AD Connect, which I cannot do in Cloud Sync. It supports pass-through authentication with Azure AD Connect. That's where I actually, when I try and authenticate to Azure AD, it actually sends that authentication request to domain controllers to authenticate and then send that back. So Azure AD Connect supports that, Cloud Sync does not. I can filter on objects attribute values with Azure AD Connect. Then there's a whole bunch of things that Connect allows, like advanced customization for attribute flows, write back, that's huge. Write back of password, devices, groups. Azure AD domain services support. That's where it sends the regular password hash in addition to the hash of the hash. Then there's things like hybrid write back, unlimited numbers of objects. So we can kind of get those additional capabilities. And Azure AD Connect supports groups with up to 250,000 members. So that isn't supported by Cloud Sync. So we can see there are things that Azure AD Connect supports that Cloud Sync does not. Whereas Cloud Sync has things that Connect can't do, like the disconnected forest, lightweight agents, multiple active agents for better kind of failover. So what you're going to have to do is for your environment, look at what are the things you are actually using. And then once you have those, you can kind of make a decision on which one of these is the right fit. So when I think of Cloud Sync, because if I think the direction is Cloud Sync, that's where things are going. This, from a timing perspective, is a 2-minute interval. So it's 2 minutes both for kind of users, groups, and kind of the password hashes. So it's actually a bit quicker than the Azure AD Connect, which is by default 30 minutes for the kind of user group, etc. But, so there is no LDAP directory support. that may be an issue. The bigger one, I think, is this lack of write back. Depending on what you're using, that may be a big deal to not have that. There is no support for Azure AD domain services, so that managed domain that I might want created in Azure and linked to a network. It doesn't support that regular password hash sync, so it can't do that. There's no pass-through authentication support where I'm using domain controllers, and there are no 250,000 group support. Don't know how many people have those, but hey, I can't do that. But on the plus side, hey, I get disconnected forest support. And remember, I can mix these. I could absolutely have the idea of Azure AD Connect doing my regular domain, and I get some new disconnected forest. I could use Cloud Sync for that. I can mix them. We get those active agents. So if an agent fails on a particular OS instance, no big deal. I don't have to manually do a failover like with Azure AD Connect and the staging. It's just going to carry on working. They're lightweight. There's no big, maybe a SQL database I have to worry about maintaining or updating an Azure AD Connect. There's very little to do. And I really do think of it as kind of the future focus. And realize these gaps it has today, I would fully expect to go away. This is new, Cloud Sync is new. Over time, I would expect those to disappear, and for nearly all environments eventually, you'd be able to use Cloud Sync. Maybe apart from the really complicated environments, then you would maybe still use Azure AD Connect. So in terms of which one do you use, my guidance would be, if you can, then this would be my kind of first choice. So I would want to use Azure AD Connect Cloud Sync because I'm reducing my responsibilities. I'm getting these nice lightweight agents. I'm getting this active set of capabilities. I get that disconnected forest support. But if there are features it does not have that I need, then obviously, hey, I'll use Azure AD Connect because that probably does things that I can't do. Remember, the whole point of this is you can mix them. So I can absolutely have this scenario where, hey, maybe I'm using Azure AD Connect for the bulk of my environment, but I'll use Azure AD Cloud Sync for maybe a subset of other objects. And remember the whole key point here as well, if I had some disconnected forest, I could use Azure AD Connect for my main domain, my main forest, and then I could absolutely use Cloud Sync to the same Azure AD for the disconnected forest. And I could have multiple of those all going here. So I get some nice combinations. I'm not breaking my rules. The rules were about Azure AD Connect. One Azure AD Connect can talk to one Azure AD. One Azure AD can talk to one Azure AD Connect instance. I'm not breaking that rule. This is not an Azure AD Connect instance. I can do this. An object can only replicate by one SIG instance. I'm not breaking that rule. These are a different set of objects than that. So that's it. I just wanted to kind of go through those, explain them. As a direction, you're going to try and use Azure AD Connect Cloud Sync if you can, if it does the features you need. Over time, I would expect those things it doesn't do to go away. But maybe you're going to stick with Azure AD Connect. Then maybe there's certain rich rule sets you're building. There's the features that you need today. Hey, just stay on Azure AD Connect. Maybe you can start to step in the water of Azure AD Connect Cloud Sync by maybe having certain OUs to start testing it. And they actually have documentation on that. And again, that's in the description. But if you want to try around that, it talks about piloting Azure AD Connect Cloud Sync in an existing hybrid forest. And it has a tutorial on doing that setup. So the configuration I had where I was ignoring a certain OU for Azure AD Connect, it walks through how to do that. And then limiting Cloud Sync just to that OU. So it walks you through the entire thing. These are in the description. And so you could go and play around with it. But I hope that helped. Yes, 2 technologies. yes, this is where I want to go, but maybe it doesn't do everything I need right now. And so I would use this. So good luck, and I'll see you on the next video.